records, my Uncle Terry had been in the RAF, ground crew or something for Lancaster Bombers, and he had a collection of Glenn Miller recordings. And I was probably about 9 or 10, and I used to go to Uncle Terry's house, and he'd play all the, and I thought, listening to the drums. And then there was one called St. Louis Blues March, and it was like marching drums. And I was impressed with the sound of those snare drums and things. Interspersed with those tracks, he'd play a 78 of Spike Jones and his City Slickers, which was like comedy stuff. But Spike Jones was a prolific drummer. He was a great drummer, but he'd used a lot of effects like shotguns and frying pans and stuff like that. I was intrigued with all that. I still am. And you'll hear odd noises throughout a Hollies show of horns going off occasionally or something weird. I like to throw those in, which sounds bizarre, but it keeps the band happy. So, yeah, I started all those years ago getting interested in drums. Mum, at that time, had a little grocer's shop. She sold sweets and chocolate and whatever the local people needed. And we had a radiogram, and it was a case of Mum and Dad playing records, or I sussed out I could play the records and play along to the record on biscuit tins, Cadbury's Roses tins, with a lid slightly adjusted so it rattled like what I thought was a snare drum. And I also borrowed 2 large paintbrushes from the art department at Nelson Grammar School, and these I thought were drumsticks. So I was about 11 then, and it just built from there. When I got my first snare drum from a junk shop, and I borrowed money off Dad to get my first kit, but I never had proper lessons. I was pretty well self-taught, and by that time I was very much into jazz. Jerry Mulligan, and then Art Blakey, and later on Charlie Mingus and Thelonious Monk. And running parallel to all that was the advent of rock and roll and the West Coast sound of Earl Palmer's drums on most of those West Coast recordings, like Eddie Cochran records and Dion. That was all this great drummer called Earl Palmer. And I thought, yeah, even though I like jazz, and I was playing in a jazz club in my later teens, I could see how I could express myself in rock and blues, and it was a progression. Jazz to me was like the workshop, the experimental station for developing then into a new form of playing rock, which I tried to do. You'll hear that on our early recordings. And by the time I joined the Hollies, and we were going into Abbey Road studios, and I remember the first time I went in, it was number 3 studio, and we were doing a track called Stay. It was a cover of a Maurice Williams song, and ours was like an up-tempo, excited stage version that you can feel the electricity on there. And I thought, even before anybody played or sung, I was in first. The first thing you hear is the drums. Yeah. And it went on into just one look, and then to prove that it was working and getting people's ears, much later on in life, a very good friend of mine, the late Cozy Powell, said to me, he said, when I heard that drum lead in on Here I Go Again, which was like one of our early singles, that made me want to play drums. And I thought, wow, I've done something. And Cozy, Cozy Powell, one of the greatest. Yeah. Sadly, he's no longer, but great friend and a great player. So I was aware that I wanted to set my stall out differently to anybody else, like a Ringo or Charlie Watts. I wanted to be adventurous, and nobody told me what to play. Ron Richards never said, the guys never said anything. I just played, and I got away with it. So, sometimes I listen now, blimey, that was a bit over the top, a little bit busy, you could say. But that was I want to be up there with the front line. I was expressing myself along with the vocals, phrasing with the vocals, and that's set my style up really.
But it never sticks out in terms of as running contrary to what the vocals are doing, what the top line's doing, or what the melodies are doing. It's always very complementary, even when it's busy.
Yeah. That basically was probably my plan. because I was always aware that a drummer had to be sort of a launch pad for that front line. The three-way harmony that the Hollies had, which was a progression of basically the Abbey Brothers idea that Alan Clark and Graham Nash had sung they'd sung that harmony from being 6 or 7 or 8 years old. They'd been in school, junior school together. So when the Hollies happened, there was a two-way. But then, just after the advent of the Hollies, Tony Hicks said, well, what if I had a third lower harmony, which Tony did? And then it sounded like a horn section. It gave it more spread. So there we had the three-way harmony, and it was like me and a horn section. I was thinking of me with a big band and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
From being a kid.
Yeah, well, I mean, when you listen to some of those really early records, those are the two things that stick out. Is just like the drums and the vocals, and that's kind of what it's all about.
Well, that's good. That's good. Thank you.
and so before the Hollies, you had years of gigging, semi-pro and pro.
Yeah.
I'd love to hear a bit more about that and sort of how it came to be that you were in the Hollies.
Right. Well, it started again round here up in the north of England, and I had a good friend at grammar school called Bob Palmer who encouraged me all the time, and he was a bass player, double bass player, and there was a working men's club in Cornwall called the Sefton Club, and on Saturday nights he had this 6-piece band, 2 saxers, a singer, and an old guy called George Buckley on drums. And I, by that time, was getting into enjoying a glass of beer with my chums down at the Talbot in Burnley, a pub down there, and I would sacrifice my Saturday nights out to go and sit all night by that bandstand and wait for George Buckley to go, Bob, come on. And George would do what he called the breakaway blues. He'd go up to the mic and he'd sing 3 songs, Fats Wallace song, Ain't Misbehaving, Sunny Side of the Street, and another one, and that was my chance. I was on the drums, playing with a band, big grown-up guys, and I'm a teenager. And that was my Saturday night. And after that, I'd lived over near Pendle Hill, and I'd walk home or run home elated at having played. That's what I wanted to do. I realised.
Taste for performing.
It had me then. It had me. So then I was playing in local jazz clubs. Then there's a really smooth one over in a little town called Rotten Soul, and I'd play there on Thursday nights. Again with older guys, there was swing, piano, string bass, me on drums, and it was a quintet, sax and trumpet. But we'd have guests up every other week, like Ronnie Ross, Don Rendell, Harold McNair, and I'd be on drums backing these international jazz players. So I thought, this is great, but this same friend, Bob Palmer, said, there's a rock band looking for a drummer down Nelson Imp, they're auditioning. Oh, rock, I'm not bothered about that. I'm a jazzer, I'm a jazzer. So anyway, I went and I did this gig with this fledgling rock group. And from being in this place where people like smoking and tapping their fingers and trying to look cool to jazz, there were about 300 girls dancing around the front of the stage and waving their arms and dancing around the handbags. I thought, wow, yeah, there was a bit of adulation there, and I thought, oh, to hell with this jazz, rock and roll for me.
And so that was was that a kind of like turning point that?
It was a turning point, but it was all. I then had realised that I didn't just have to play a backbeat, as I said earlier.
Yeah, it was a real way of expressing.
I was getting satisfaction out of doing what I was doing, and doing things my own way.
And a lot of the records in the 60s that you made with the Hollies were recorded at Abbey Road, which by all accounts and still is a magical place.
Yeah.
So I'd love to hear some stories of.
Sure.
Times at Abbey Road. Abbey
Road, wonderful, wonderful. I remember the first time walking in through that front door and realising that Elgar had been there. It was a big classic. There are 3 studios there, and there's a massive one. Number 2 is my favourite, but they'd have symphony orchestras there. John Barbarelli and all this stuff. You were in awe. And at that time, this pop music was it didn't really matter much to the powers that be at Abbey Road. EMI, it was called EMI Studios, and not Abbey Road. That came later with the album, the Beatles album.
Yeah.
You were all treated a bit like, yes, we understand, but we are, And you'd have the engineers, the top engineers in white coats, and then there'd be the lesser engineers in brown coats. If anything broke down, they were in and fiddling away. And they were top guys there. There were some great boffiny characters there. And there was the canteen downstairs where you go down and later on I remember standing there with my tray with my cup of tea waiting to get my rock bun or whatever it was. And I was stood at one side I had Andre Previn, the other side John Barry, and just at the back of the queue was Hank Marvin. I thought, well, I think I've arrived now. John Barry, there you go. Andre Previn.
And you were recording there at the same time as two other bands who, along with the Hollies, the longest standing group, British rock groups of all time.
The Beatles were there before us, of course. They started a year before we did in the studio. Do
you ever feel, because like when I listen to early Hollies stuff and early Beatles stuff, I mean, I say this as a massive Beatles fan as well. I don't see one beating the other. If anything, I think some of the 3-part harmonies are more sophisticated on the Hollies record. And I literally, I will repeat that I am a massive Beatles fan. Yeah. Do you ever feel like the Hollies are shortchanged somewhat in, because this is pretty groundbreaking stuff. Like now it's easy to say, rock groups sing in harmony. I'm influenced by whoever it is, the Hollies, the Beatles, or Crosby, Stills, Nash, or Eagles, or whoever. But back then it was like, well, rock and roll had happened, and Elvis and Chuck Berry.
Yeah.
But singing in harmony like that in a rock and roll context was a relatively new thing. So this is like really groundbreaking stuff. Yeah,
we were basically a performance band, and we could knock off a song in almost first take, 2 or 3 takes at most. And Ron Richards was our producer. He worked a lot with George Martin, and Ron was mainly, he'd come from the Tin Pan Alley background. He'd been a song plugger, and he wanted to get the song, if it sounded good, get it done and move on to the next one. Whereas George with the Beatles, I think he took a lot more time. I think had we had like a George character, I don't know if it worked out any better, because sometimes the atmosphere on those early recordings is electric, and I can hear, that sounded a bit, but the atmosphere is there. But as I was saying, if it was George, I think he would have made us take more time, and maybe we would have got better product in the end. But that's easily said after the event. You couldn't fault Ron in those early days, although he did like to work quickly. And in those days, the day was split into 3 sessions. There'd be a 10 till 12:30 sort of then, and then like a 2:30 till 6, and then a 6:30 till 10. And of course, once we'd earned our stripes, we record right through the day. But Ron always had to have his break, quite correctly. But Ron had to have his break at 6 o'clock, 6:30. It was round to the Abbey Tavern. There was the Abbey Tavern round the corner in those days, and that was fine. We go and do that, and then but at the end of the night, in those days, the pubs closed at 10:30. So at 10 o'clock, we were into like determined to get this track done and sweating and going like hell. And I'm looking up at the window in number 2. I'm down in the corner on the drums, and there's a big window. You can see the control room and Ron up there. And I could many a time I'd see his arm going into his raincoat. We're going away there. It's gonna. Yeah, no, that'll be fine. For example, much later on, when we were doing the backing track for Aint Heavy, me, Elton John, and Bernie Calvert on bass, and the track that we had, so there was just it was just a basic track. That's all we did first. The strings went on about 3 weeks later. But that track, it was coming to Ron's raincoat time, And yeah, that'll be fine. I said, Ron, I just did it. It's on the track now. There's a little sort of flam I did with my left hand, quite accidentally. I said, Ron, I think I made a mistake there. Can I do it? He said, don't worry. Once we get the strings on, it'll be fine.
So he was someone who really liked.
You won't hear it. It'll cover it up. But he was brilliant. He was brilliant character.
In those so you're saying days were split into 3, right? And 3 sessions of 3 hours roughly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, once
say
once we'd established ourselves,
then you were just kind of straight through.
As being sweethearts of EMI, Parlophone.
Yeah.
We'd go in after lunch. We'd start the session after
and
lunch.
Then just
work through. And as time went on, we could work through the night. Ron, the Beatles are working through the night. Can we do that? Well, you can, but I'll be going home at 10 o'clock. So he'd leave us there. And we thought, we could get some really serious stuff done now, just us and the engineer. Well, it doesn't work that way. If you give them carte blanche too much time. I remember one time Graham bought a movie, a projector in, and we were watching films of Toad of Hall, the cartoon. It's like that psychedelic era. And there's even one of the Walker Brothers. Oh, gee, that's so funny. And we tried to get recordings done. We got projecting Toad of Hall, Wind in the Willows. It was an old animated cartoon.
Hanging out watching that.
There were. Paying by the hour for recording time.
At Abbey Road as well.
Yeah.
What, EMI as it was in those days?
Yeah.
And I was going to say, so in one of those days, perhaps before you become a big deal and were able to watch Wind in the Willows, in one of those fairly rushed sessions, how many songs would you tend to try and track in a day?
Well, the first album was probably done in a day and a half. The first album, Stay with the Hollies, it was called, and it was done, in no time. In those, you were recording on 1/4-inch tape. Those very early days, 1963. It was 1/4-inch tape. So it was twin track we were recording onto. So there wasn't much opportunity to do overdubs anyway. So it was a performance. We were performing. And as time went on, very quickly we realised the potential of double tracking. For example, Just One Look that came the following year, 1964, we double tracked the harmonies and it sounded choral. But it softened things up a bit. But we were learning then, and then 4-track machine had come along, and then an 8-track, and then it progressed up to as many tracks as you want nowadays. But it was all in its infancy, but it was a magical time because nothing like that had happened before. It was like home. What had happened? We'd had Cliff and the Shadows, but we hadn't had bands that had sort of come from the north, and I don't know. We were all heavily influenced by American music, and it was a case of us absorbing what Presley had done, and Eddie Cochran and Little Richard and blues and whatever else. And by the mid-60s, we were all going to America. Thanks to the Beatles, they broke the door down. But it was such an invasion. The Americans termed it the British invasion.
Yeah.
It scared them to death. It scared them to death. Because up to then it was one-way traffic from the States. So much so that the British Musicians Union said, well, look, we've got to have an exchange thing. Count Basie band comes over and somebody else has got to go over there. Well, we're scratching our heads who we could send over before our lot arrive, After that, it was like they might stop. There's too many
British invasion.
The one-way traffic was all coming from Britain.
Yeah, it really took it by storm.
Yeah, but it was sad in a way because going to the States and going out in New York after hours, like down the jazz clubs like the Village, Vanguard, I could sit there with my feet on the front of the stage and there's Miles Davis or Charlie Mingus playing there. There's a few people drinking an odd beer. It's like people thought, well, maybe our music, American music's not hot. It was weird. I was sitting, you know, like side by side with my idols, and there's no you know, fan hysteria.
In complete contrast to what was happening.
And
with you guys.
American bands were trying to sound like British bands, you know.
Yeah,
Dressed
it
like
was
British
the defining
bands.
sound of that era, really.
Yeah, it was unbelievable, really.
And so from the 60s records, you know, obviously they're the big hits that everybody knows, and I kind of want to, like, for this series, just ask you, what are some of your favourite records that maybe people don't chat to you about all the time, that you feel like, oh, that's one that got lost a little bit?
Some of the early B-sides I thought were good of ours, because we realised that even if we hadn't written the A-side, Alan and Graham certainly realised that they got their names on the B-side, it had earned as much as the A. It was glued, as Nash said, it was glued to the A-side, so it had earned just the same, which it did. So there are some good tracks on our B-sides, some good album tracks. Too many to list, really. You know, we did like For Certain Records, that was a good album. Evolution, which was like a Flower Power album, and yeah, I can't sort of. Obviously, there's the obvious ones that I do like, but obscure ones, you know, people say, "What's he talking about?" So I just keep those to myself. There's a lot of quality there, and we did on some of those mid-60s albums. We used quite a few added orchestrations. You know, strings and things. But going back to the early days, so you've got to realise that the Hollies were just a drum kit, a guitar, and a guitar plugged into an amplifier, and a bass plugged into an amplifier. That was it. Graham Nash had a guitar, but he never plugged in. So that was our sound. So you listen to those early records, it's just Tony on guitar, and Eric on bass, and me on drums. As we progressed through the 60s, we thought, oh, we need, what can we use? So, for example, Tony, I've got a banjo, and there were timpani, and there were glockenspiel, and we were, because of the classical sessions that they had at Abbey Road, the walls were like where they stored the celeste or the xylophones or whatever, and we'd start dragging these out and tracking them on. Once the multi-tracking progressed, oh yeah, we need a different sound. For example, Carry On, we used steel drums, the West Indian guys. That was a bit of a pantomime, because we'd recorded the track and left the gap for the solo, and Ron said, I know there's a guy so-and-so, he plays in a West Indian steel. So this guy arrives, and the drum is like, it's like a tune with the track. So a bit of very speed in those days, but it's still. So I remember me giving a clout with a sledgehammer to try and get it. We got it in tune with the track. You know. But that's how you tuned a steel drum with a sledgehammer. Excuse me.
It's such a iconic part of the track, and also, I mean, that record could have been made to sound so much more similar to what you guys had done before, but it just stood out because
it was a summer song. It worked well. It was a summer song. But then again, you know, what can we use next? We used bagpipes on one song, believe it or not. It's an album track with basically a hard year. But yeah, so it was all experimentation.
So there's way more experimentation towards the end of the 60s.
Yeah.
And then like early 70s. You still continued having like big hits.
The biggest, Aint Heavy had just gone on 1969, so that was a massive. But then Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress.
Because that was. But what was the story behind that? That you had you recorded it in the late 60s, and then it got and then it got all written in the late 60s, and then you redid it or something like that. Is that not right?
No. We recorded it, and it wasn't recorded at Abbey Road either. It was recorded at Air London, that in those days was right in Oxford Circus, right up in the roof. That's where the studio was then.
Oh, right.
Because Ron Richards and George Martin and 1 or 2 others had formed the company, Air London. It was Ron Richards' idea to form the company.
Oh, right.
Ron sadly had problems late health-wise, and he was like, sidelined, and George took all the credit. But Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress was recorded up there and written by Alan Clark and Roger Cook. They went out for a heavy lunch and came back with that.
Oh, good result from a.
And it was #1 in the States, which is nice.
Well, I mean, it's an absolutely, it's a fantastic record. But I don't know where I'd read that, but what was that, 72 that came out? But
with no intention of that being a single. We had to complete this album, and the Americans wanted it. Epic, CBS Epic wanted it. A guy called Don Elliott said, "Hey Tony, we need this album." "Oh yeah, we're just finishing it off, Don." Clarky comes in, so plays the track, and that's fine. He played it, it's like Country and West, played it fast. We slowed it down, did the thing. Had we considered it to be a possible single, I reckon we'd have put harmonies on it, and that would have probably softened it up.
Because I mean, the harmonies are amazing, but it shows how versatile the band are.
So on there's just like a couple of guitars, bass and drums, and Clarky's voice.
It just sounds great, and it shows the versatility that you guys.
So that was a godsend. We didn't start messing around with it, but and Ron wasn't there. Ron was ill at the time, and I remember he came back. He heard it. No, I can't tell what Alan's singing. We need to do the vocals again. He tried to do the vocals again and absolutely ruined it. Thankfully, we rescued it and it went out as it was. By that time, the Americans had it, and they had the album, and the Don Ellis phoned Tony Hicks up and said, "Hey Tony, this Long Cool Woman, we want it as a single." Tony said, "Well, you take it as a single then, and that was it.
Yeah, it was a huge. And so, He Ain't Heavy, was that and Long Cool Woman, but they released after Graham Nash left?
Yeah.
Both of them?
Yeah.
So that's,
and one that's almost bigger still, The Air That I Breathe, 1974.
I mean, obviously there's some great songs, he did Bus Stop and Carry On and all sorts of things when he was in the band, but
Great writer is Graham.
Yeah.
And the best harmony singer. He sings harmony without going into falsetto. Like the Beach Boys type people, they go into falsetto. Graham has a naturally high voice, and he can hit those notes without going into falsetto, which gave it the power. Him and Clarky and Tony singing together. I mean, the power, the horn section hit you, sat in front of him. Yeah.
Yeah, it is that.
It wasn't a little squeaky voice up to a microphone.
It's that range that he's got.
Yeah.
Combined with his ear for harmony.
Blow your head off.
But you guys, because those three songs, I think those are the three that, if you looked you guys up on Spotify or on Apple Music or one of the modern streaming platforms, which are kind of reductive because they limit people to an initial selection of like 10 biggest tracks. But those have been streamed something like 100 million times or something.
They are strong songs, and they come very much towards the end of our show, and we'll rock out with Long Cool Woman in a Black Dress and get everybody up, and that's an extended version, so that's a bit of fun. I can have on stage and lay into it.
Yeah.
But it's all dramatic. I mean, you mentioned heavy. He Ain't Heavy. You think, I've been playing that for so many years, but it's still emotional. And sometimes when you can see the front couple of rows, you can see people, it means something to them one way or another, and they can be getting emotional. So it is an emotional song, and I never get tired of playing that. I can sink right into it when I'm playing it. And the Air That I Breathe with the big chorus there.
Yeah.
And they all start singing it and gives Pete a rest. Pete, I was singing Pete. So Pete, you cheated. He's got you for the old bit. You don't need to sing. You can save his voice.
The audience.
Yeah.
And so you've been on the road for like 55 years.
55 years, yeah.
I mean, that's quite incredible.
1963. Yeah, we've never really gone away. We've toured every year. We've toured every year somewhere or other. We've had our ups and downs. We've had people come and go, but 55 years, yeah.
And you must have had the most amazing life in terms of just random things, even like aside from all the massive hits and all the touring.
Just little things like riding on Concorde. We flew on the Air France Concorde from Paris to Venezuela, Caracas. And it stopped off in the Azores at was it Santa Maria somewhere, to refuel. And in those days, there was no security whatsoever. You just had some steps to walk down, and you could like walk around, sit on the front wheel of it. And we're just wandering around Concord and tapping on it and things in the middle of the bloody Atlantic. Unbelievable. And there you set off and you're doing twice the speed of sound, and there's a digital readout at the front, 1,400 and something miles an hour. Wow. And you're drinking Dom Perignon. How lovely.
Yeah, these incredible moments, and the people that you've met as well, and worked with, who are like your contemporaries. Or I read somewhere that like John Paul Jones from like Led Zeppelin had just played like bass on like Hollies records, just like casually, or
Yeah, no.
These people must come in and out of your life like it.
Well, he came in. Our bass player at the time, Eric, he would go walkabout. So John Paul came in and did the B side of I Can't Let Go. I think it's called Don't Run and Hide. But I knew John Paul because I'd seen him working with Chet Harris and Tony Meehan before he was known. But the thing is here that we mentioned the Everly Brothers earlier, obviously a big influence. We were doing the London Palladium when they used to do a TV show from there, Sunday night at the London Palladium. And we were doing a couple of songs. It was all live in those days. You did 2 songs. And Rod Shields, our road manager, got a phone call backstage. Hey, this is Phil Everly. Oh, yeah, sure, yeah. Yeah, no, the Hollies. We need some songs. We're in the Decca Studios. We need some songs. So he put him on to Graham. This is 1966. You're kidding me? You know. It was Phil Everly. Oh wow, yeah, we'll be around. So they went round to Decca the following day. There's an album out called Two Yanks in London, and the Hollies wrote 3/4 or 2/3 of that album.
That's unbelievable.
It's under a name called L. Ransford that Tony and Alan used to write under. L. Ransford means Clark, Nash and Hicks. I don't know why they did that, but that's how it was.
I think, it was quite a few people did that.
Yeah, well, we're advised, the 3 names, it takes too much room up on the label. So there's something going on there with this early management stuff that I won't get into now. But anyway, so we're at Decca Studios, and there's John Paul on bass, Jimmy Page on guitar, and Tony on guitar, because they did some Hollies songs. So Tony's teaching Jimmy Page how to play a song called Hard Year, where Tony, on our original one, on the album, had used a fuzz box, a distortion box, and Jimmy was trying to get this right. So I only played on one track because I'd gone home. We'd been to the States and I needed to get home, and by the time I got back, they got almost every track done. They'd used a session drummer called Andy White. But it was, John Paul was there again with Tony and Alan and Graham and Jimmy Page. And I remember when I was there as well, the great Joe Moretti was there, but he wasn't playing, but he was the guy who played on Shaking All Over, so he was God to me. You know, that great British classic Shaking All Over that shook the British rock and roll foundations, because it was the first rock and roll song for me in this country that didn't sound like your average British sort of polite production. It sounded like an American recording, and that was wonderful. But anyway, I'm digressing there. But yeah, John Paul Jones, great bass player.
Well, I mean, you must have just come across characters like that. Like, that's just like a tiny like
Burt Bacharach. We recorded with Burt Bacharach.
With him playing as well.
He was on harpsichord. In fact, it wasn't. We tried it with harpsichord. But he used the Challen piano, which is always in Abbey Road Studios. It had been used for years. It's an upright piano that has a special pedal that puts a metal plate on the thing, so it clank, 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 clank. So Burt Bacharach's playing that, and we do a song called After the Fox, which was the title music for the film After the Fox. It was Peter Sellers was in it, and Peter came in as well into number 2 studio and did the voiceovers. He did some funny asides, and Peter's going in there. We've never met Peter Sellers, so he comes down the staircase at number 2 with George Martin, who was his producer, Ron Richards, our producer, and so he comes down and went, Peter Sellers is going to be glum as anything. But he went over to the grand piano and threatened to karate chop it. We thought that's about the funniest thing he did. But he did the funnier sides, you know. Who is the fox? I am the fox. It was all that. And I remember Ron and George not falling out, but George had the harmonies, Hollies harmonies far too low. And Ron, no, George, they're in the box. No, we can't do it. Anyway,
he wanted them low. And
well, it was just like a back. It was like
a backing thing. Yeah, it's really important that it's we level, got, I guess, isn't it?
Yeah, we got what we wanted.
Yeah, well.
But I don't think the film was much of a success. But there we were working with Burt Bacharach, and we were all impressed to be invited to work with Burt Bacharach, because a few days before we went round to his Muse house. He rented a Muse house, and in those days he was married to the beautiful actress Angie Dickinson. So we were all eager to meet Angie, but she never came down.
It's been a grave disappointment.
Hey, Bert, is Angie coming down? No, she's just.
And so after you had, songs that remain iconic to this day, in the 60s and 70s, what were the 80s and 90s, and what was it like in those decades, in terms of, because you continue to be a phenomenally successful touring band and releasing really successful albums, but just when you've had so much success already and you've kept going, like other bands split up, and then there's obviously a tendency to focus on the moments that were just like huge international successings.
Yeah,
but it's equally interesting to know what it's like for people who are really successful, kind of continuing on and waking up every day and still working at it.
Yeah, well, to kick off the 80s, we were working on an album, and let me see, let me get all these decades in order. I usually work off. It's like milestones. The bus stop was 66, and it's like milestones through my life. Well, records 69 heavy. It's all the miles. It's a signpost, the road going back, and all the milestones and signposts.
People probably just run for a few of those and then just go to today.
Yeah.
And I kind of.
So leaping into the 80s. We kicked it off with working with Graham Nash again, and we did an album. We were already working on an album, but I tell you what, it was a time of the Stars on 45 carry on, where there were hit records, there were medleys of hits done by other people. And Tony said to me, we should do our own. How do you mean? He said, well, we'll go into Abbey Road and we'd get the original mixers, the quarter-inch tape, and splice them together, and it's all us. And what we did, we put some claps on and a bass drum, and we had a thing called Holidays. So it got in the top 30. So Top of the Pops, Johnny Stewart, phoned up, said, what's the chance of getting you guys on Top of the Pops this coming, whatever, Wednesday, when it was done then. But what's the chance of getting Graham Nash over to do it? Oh, Tony said, well, I'll phone him. So Graham said, send me 2 tickets, I'll be over. So Graham came over, we did Top of the Pops. After the session, we were working at, I think it was Advision, doing an album. And Graham came in, and you can't stop Graham singing. He was on the mic singing with us again. And it sounded great. And so that was it had planted the seed for us then, shortly afterwards, to go over to, he had a studio called Rudy Records in Hollywood. We went over there and did a complete album of songs, and the album's called What Goes Around. What Goes Around. And that was a fantastic experience, being there, being in LA and Hollywood after being there in the 60s. We were there again, going to the Polo Lounge at the Beverly Hills Hotel and on the cocktails, and we stayed at the Sunset Marquee, where we had our own villa and a garden with hummingbirds in and all that sort of stuff. It was total wonderful, and working with Graham again, of course, and we toured the States on the back of that just shortly after that. So that was a nice lead into the 80s.
Sounds like a very the right way to start the decade.
It was good. It was good, and that's. I've just completed a book. I've always kept diaries. I've just finished my book, and that's where the book finishes. in that garden with the hummingbirds, or sipping champagne in the polo lounge, and that's where it rounds it off. What goes around comes around, and that's where the book finishes, because I've got like 80,000 words. So it gives me an option to do a part 2 if I ever feel like it.
Well, I'd definitely read part 2. I'd be equally interested in both parts. I think it requires an equal amount of determination. A lot of people would rest on their laurels and just say, well, you know what, we've already had Bus Stop and Carry On, and you know.
Well, keeping the diaries. It's me being quite a sad case, and keeping a diary for like most of my life. From seeing my father doing a diary for his pet, for his business and stuff. So young Robert at school had a little diary, so it built from there. And I've always kept a diary, and it's becoming so useful that when I wrote the book, it was
you can refer to
just go through it.
Well, I can't wait to read it. It's going to be it's going to be really fascinating. Thank you so much, Bobby. It's been really fascinating.
My pleasure. Thank you.